At 9:17 a.m., the judge adjusted his glasses, misread my last name, and every person who knew me stayed silent. The courtroom breathed in a careful administrative rhythm that had nothing to do with heartbeats and everything to do with calendars, a weekday bustle organized by fluorescent lights that flattened color and by the clerk's patient monotone that sanded the edges off urgency. And while paper stacks rose like small pale skylines along counsel tables, I stood inside the chill of recycled air and felt how institutional ceilings can make a person feel both seen and very far away. A scuff on the floor caught my eye, where countless chairs had been dragged back by people who wanted to speak, and hesitated, the hum of the microphones braided with the squeak of leather shoes, and as the minute hand swept to that particular angle between numbers that my body already knew, I realized there is a distinctly American quiet that lives in rooms like this, an etiquette of restraint that asks you to fold up your rage into something portable and polite. I had folded mine for years because they were my people, and I wanted to belong, because the word they used, Aunty, first arrived as a ribbon on a casserole dish and a chorus in a living room, and by the time it climbed into dentist forms and school sign-in sheets and hospital intake windows, it had learned to wear a badge that said tradition, which sounded safer than the truth, convenience. I was belittled so softly that I mistook the politeness for love, told myself the ache underneath it was simply the price of harmony. And each time someone corrected my name to Aunty with a smile, I swallowed what I knew about the difference between affection and authority, about how a nickname can be a hallway where you wander for so long you forget there is a door. The ache for belonging does strange math when a child is the variable, because the night before hearings and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, you can be the only person awake with a small forehead burning against your collarbone, pacing hallways that smell like lemon cleaner and steam from the shower, humming nonsense until the fever loosens its grip, and in those hours you make bargains you would never make under fluorescent lights. In that same apartment elevator this morning, a small hand had found mine and squeezed with that unteachable certainty children possess, the kind that says, "Do not disappear," and I bent to press a kiss into warm hair the way a notary presses a seal, a quiet affirmation of something already true, before I stepped into a rideshare that smelled faintly of coffee and methylated optimism and tried to slow my breath all the way to the courthouse steps. Belonging makes promises, fierce love keeps them, and as I passed through security with my folder hugged against my chest, I felt the shape of everything I had gathered, not as a weapon but as grammar, the pediatric form where my relation box had been corrected by someone else's neat black pen, the school email removing my portal access, 2 days after a family meeting I wasn't invited to, the notary stamp whose timestamp contradicted the birthday video still stuck to my refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a gull, the letter from the aunt whose steady ink said temporary when everyone else had started to say permanent, in the kind of careful voice people use when they want you to be grateful for a demotion. I reached into my coat and touched the USB the way a talisman is touched by people who claim to be above talismans, felt its cool edge against my thumb and the reassurance of the audio I had captured, the breath and the laughter and the instruction disguised as a joke. Just call her Aunty, that I had renamed, with a steadiness I wasn't sure I owned until that night, to Aunty Protocol. The clerk called my docket number with that municipal patience they teach in training videos, smoothing even my name into a serviceable shape, and when the syllables came out unfamiliar, I waited for a voice from the row behind me to correct it. Any voice at all, because some graces are so small and so easy they ought to be inevitable. The silence that followed was tidy and practiced, not the stunned kind, but the kind people keep ready in their pockets for moments when truth might ask to speak, and I understood with a clarity that tasted like metal that the politics of my family had become portable, that they traveled with us like a carry-on, and this room, however public, would not unmake them unless I did. The judge adjusted his glasses again, 2 fingers to the bridge, a brief lift, a careful polish with a folded square of cloth that appeared from nowhere and returned there, and I felt the room's attention lean with mine toward that ritual, toward the plain suggestion that clear sight is not an accident, it is maintained. The adoption papers lay inside my manila folder in paragraphs that pretended to be neutral, and the neutrality would have comforted me if neutrality had not been the shield under which my name had been put into quotation marks. Still, I took comfort in the measurables, the lines and dates and signatures that could be compared against themselves until they confessed who had been careful and who had been clever. When I raised my head, the judge was already reading, and the room entered that collective breath hold I had feared and prepared for in equal measure, the exquisite hush that happens when strangers become witnesses. My name came out of his mouth like a small test, an instrument slowly calibrating, and the fact of hearing it, even bent slightly, even softened at the end, sent a current through me that started where the child's hand had been and moved into my chest, a name affirmation so physical it startled me, because for a moment I was not belittled or bargaining, but simply present at the sound of myself becoming official. My eyes watered before I could warn them not to, and I blinked hard, not because tears would weaken my case, but because I needed to see the lines on the page sharply enough to point when the time came, sharply enough to show how a signature can mimic the loop of my Y and still betray itself at the downstroke, sharply enough to place the audio where the paper resisted, the voice where the ink lied. Everything I carried, the receipts, the letter, the file photographs, the timestamps, sat inside the folder like a small city ready to light up, and still I felt the ghost of the old ache reach for me, the temptation to apologize for insisting, for making a room full of people hear the difference between culture and choreography. But then I remembered that sunrise kiss on a hot forehead and the way the tiny fingers had tightened as the elevator descended, and my spine answered for me. I was not here for revenge. I was here to be readable, legible, pronounceable, and to make the system pronounce me correctly, even if kindness failed, where law would not. If you are the mother, why do all exhibits call you only Aunty? To answer him, I have to go back to the moment when the nickname stopped being a kindness and started being a contract. The first time they called me Aunty, it sounded like love. The third time, it sounded like a rule. I can trace the beginning to a kitchen lacquered with steam and sleep deprivation, the newborn's breath damp against my collarbone as relatives orbited with casseroles and opinions, the whole room clinking with spoons and approval, and when someone tested the word on me, Aunty, it landed like a soft blanket tucked around the edges of a life I already recognized, because the child had spent the night sprawled on my chest, and I had memorized the rhythm of tiny lungs the way people memorize hymns, and I was too busy being grateful to argue with vowels. I laughed along, I poured tea, I caught the baby's rooting mouth with a knuckle and swayed in a loop that felt like belonging. And when the word came a second time, ribboned with chuckles and a camera flash, I told myself language is elastic and that what we mean matters more than what we say, even though I already knew there are words that tidy you into a corner where you take up less space and call it respect. It is strange how repetition teaches the ear to surrender, how an affectionate nickname becomes scaffolding for something heavier, how you wake up inside the easy American habit of smoothing conflict with courtesy, and don't notice the terms have shifted until they show up in places that bill by the hour, because the third time I heard it was at the pediatric office when the nurse spoke it into the chart as if it were my legal name, the syllables settling into the box marked relation as if they had a deed, and I felt the pleasant kitchen word harden into policy. I didn't correct her fast enough because I didn't want to sound ungrateful, and by the time my mouth caught up, the cursor had moved on to vaccinations and insurance, and I walked out holding a diaper bag, a discharge form, and a suspicion that I had just co-signed a contract I had never seen. In the family WhatsApp, the anthropology of our downfall was pinned in place, my name receding into the scroll like a shoreline as Aunty surged to the top with a smiley and a heart, and the archives became a museum of tiny reframings. Aunty will take the 10 a.m. appointment. Aunty picked up the forms. Aunty knows a teacher. The possessive my vanished first, then the definite the, until I was an object of convenience wrapped in the grammar of affection. Screenshots don't raise their voices, but they do establish pattern, and late at night when the apartment dimmed to a halo around the crib, I scrolled back through months and watched my own name fade like a watermark, almost visible, almost gone, and I understood how small changes become precedent when no one says stop. The first paperwork slip wore a friendly face, a cousin with a reliable grin who loved errands and scanner apps, and the performative competence of a person who announces, "I'll handle it," before anyone has asked, and his name, Daniel, arrived with praise from elders who adored initiative, so I thanked him while he filled in the pediatric packet with a pen that wrote a steadier history than my sleep-deprived hand could manage. Somewhere between allergies and emergency contacts, my relation was adjusted downward, a neat little downgrade that looked like help because the lines were straight and the ink didn't blot. And I didn't notice until the receptionist spoke to me as if I were an occasional visitor, and the portal emailed updates to a different address. I told myself it was a clerical hiccup, because believing in hiccups is easier than admitting you are being translated into something smaller. Daniel thrived on late-night efficiency, always texting after midnight with a PDF I hadn't requested or a form I hadn't seen, his compliments choreographing my consent. "You're doing great. Less stress for you. Let me keep the paper organized." And when I hesitated, he would pivot into family loyalty, that velvet hammer of a phrase that makes you want to apologize for wanting boundaries. And he would say, "Auntie's got this," as if the word were armor rather than camouflage. I didn't know then that he was building a file cabinet where my name would be filed under courtesy instead of custody, that his promises would become citations, that our private shorthand would graduate into institutional language because people like things tidy, and Aunty is a tidy way to love you without authority. The cost of all that tidiness was my own reflection, a slow erosion of confidence that made me rehearse corrections in the car and then choose silence in the room, because I worried that insisting on my name would make me sound possessive or petty or un-American in the way Americans sometimes fear being, difficult in public. I began to scrutinize my sentences for edges, to sand down my requests until they squeaked, and yet even in my gentlest voice I could feel the small tremor of a person trying to keep a floor from tilting. The ache for belonging pulsed steady, but under it I felt a gathering heat, the fierce love that had carried me through fevers and tantrums and first steps down a hallway slick with bathwater, the love that knows the difference between courtesy and consent. I should have recognized the motive sooner. The way centralizing decision power feels like safety to people who want to curate a narrative. The way my steadiness made me useful, but my name made me inconvenient. And how the title they offered me resolved their optics while dissolving my authority. It is elegant, really, the trick of turning affection into administration, of moving a woman from mother to mascot with a word that smiles while it locks doors. The math works for everyone but the person being subtracted, and I watched my access shrink in little ways that never made a scene. A school email I didn't receive, a doctor instruction relayed secondhand, a field trip permission slip managed elsewhere, each a small paper cut that drew no blood until the day you needed your hands to be recognized by a scanner that only speaks the language on file. I remember the exact moment the trick stopped looking like care. I was assembling a binder, tabs for medical, school, legal, a thin column for receipts that made sense only to me, when a thin rectangle slid loose from the pocket flap, a thermal paper strip that had stuck to nothing, curling at the edges like a secret refusing to lie flat. The header belonged to a neighborhood business center, the timestamp stamped in reliable black, and beneath it a fax confirmation to a number I recognized as the pediatric office, the recipient line typed neat as a classroom label, guardianship documents. The sender name read Daniel. I traced the digits twice and then a third time, the room contracting into the measured click of my pen against the table. And as I turned the strip over, the ink imprint pressed faint on my fingers like an accusation too light to bruise and too precise to ignore, because I had never approved any guardianship document. Not that day, not any day. I stood very still, the apartment holding its breath around me, and pictured the nurse's cursor, the receptionist's refusal, the portal's locked door, and the way a nickname, repeated enough, becomes a key that only works from the outside. Paper cuts don't bleed at first, until you need medical access. "We can't discuss this with you, ma'am. You're not on the legal record." The first time a stranger said those words to me, I was standing at the kitchen counter with a pen uncapped between my fingers and the late afternoon sun flattening across the laminate like a sheet of gold leaf, and the on-hold music from the pediatric office threaded through the room with the tinny cheerfulness of something designed to keep tempers level, while my heart tried to convince my throat that breath and voice could coexist. The nurse came back on the line and recited the policy in a cadence that sounded practiced enough to be muscle memory, each clause landing with the tact of a safety video. And when she asked me to verify my relation, I gave my name with the deliberate care of a person spelling a password in a public place, because somewhere in me I believed that if I said it cleanly enough, The software would agree that I belonged to what I already belonged to. The pause that followed felt like a courthouse stairwell, all echo and no faces. Then she told me I wasn't listed, that the portal contact was someone else, that privacy rules applied equally to everyone, and that if I could have the legal guardian call back, they would be happy to help. I did not cry, because crying at a policy script feels like arguing with a fence. So I asked for a supervisor, and while I waited, I slid my finger along the folder tabs I had made a week earlier: medical, school, legal, receipts, trying to find a page where the story had forked away from me. A small hand tugged at the hem of my shirt, and I looked down to see those familiar eyes, the child awake from a nap, the lashes still wet at the corners, the fingers testing the fabric until they found my knuckles, and I tilted the phone between shoulder and ear to kiss a warm forehead without losing the call. That intimate choreography that mothers know and offices cannot measure. The supervisor picked up and spoke with a voice that carried 2 decades of American healthcare training, all empathy wrapped around protocol, and she explained that my status was listed as temporary caregiver, which would be fine for pickups and forms, but did not authorize access to lab notes or treatment plans. And when I said that clause was supposed to expire months ago, she told me the system showed a renewal. In the quiet that followed, I could hear the judge's glasses from an hour in the future, the light tap on the bridge, the fabric square buffing clarity into metal, and I steadied myself with that sound even though it wasn't real yet, because I needed to borrow the calm of a man who believes paper will eventually resolve to truth. I asked the supervisor when the renewal had been entered and who authorized it, and she read me a date that rang against my skull like a dropped lid. The same Saturday as the birthday party video, where frosting had smeared across small faces and the adults sang off-key in a chaotic chorus, the camera panning at the exact moment the notary stamps time would later insist I was someplace else approving a status I had never seen. The stamp and the video could not both be right, and I suddenly understood that a family celebration had been used as camouflage for paperwork, a magic trick, performed in a daylight crowded with candles and cousins. I called Emily next, because false ally is not a title you recognize until after the reveal, and in real time she simply sounded warm and competent and tired of drama, the way people do when "let's not make a scene" is their favorite lullaby. She told me she would handle it, that offices make mistakes, that the nurse was probably new, that she would text Daniel because he knew the practice manager's cousin, and that by morning this would all be fixed. Her voice had the lull and shine of a showroom, and I wanted desperately to sit down in it and rest, but I had been taught too often that rest at the wrong moment is consent in a prettier dress. So I said thank you and opened my laptop instead, teaching my hands a discipline they would later use in court. Every email saved into dated folders, every voicemail downloaded as an MP3 with a file name that began with the year, every form photographed front and back with the edges in frames so the crop wouldn't muddy the stamp, every WhatsApp export tucked into a directory whose structure only I would understand. It felt obsessive and it felt necessary, and I told myself that America isn't cruel so much as bureaucratic, which can be a kind of mercy if you are willing to meet it with receipts, because the same doors that close on a mislabeled name will open for a properly tabbed binder, and if you can show a chain of custody, of emails, of revisions, then even politeness has to step aside and let logic through. The ache for belonging sagged inside my ribs, asking whether it might be easier to accept the nickname and the downgraded box and the second-hand updates. But fierce love tightened somewhere deeper, reminding me of fever nights and elevator squeezes, and the moment my name sounded like itself in the judge's mouth. And in that memory, I found the energy to build a paper city that could not be rearranged without leaving fingerprints. The American habit of turning labels into gatekeeping doesn't announce itself with sirens. It arrives in small squares on screens and drop-down menus, and the kind of clerical courtesies that sound harmless until they lock a door. And the trick of surviving it is to learn the language without letting it rewrite your life. I started drafting a request letter to the practice manager asking for the audit log, the entry history for my status changes, the user IDs attached to each revision, and the dates and times of portal access modifications. And even typing those words steadied me, because they erected a structure where my heart could rest and my voice could stop apologizing for the size of what it carried. If my family would not say my name, the metadata would, And that was suddenly a comfort nearly as physical as the weight of the child who had fallen asleep now, face tucked against my arm, breath evening out into a rhythm I could match without thinking. The email from Emily arrived at 9:52 p.m. with a subject line promising resolution and a body full of reasons to wait until Monday, coupled with a sentence that asked me, again, not to escalate, because people talk and schools talk and the city is smaller than we think, and auntie is such a gentle word for a woman who doesn't want trouble. I stared at the glow of the screen until the letters doubled, then set the phone face down and slid the binder back into my bag, and in that small act I felt the pivot, the internal click of a person who decides that evidence will speak where love won't, that a clean transcript is a better ally than a warm apology, and that the system might be indifferent, but it is not deaf if you speak in the dialect it recognizes. I was naming files when the ping sounded, that quick sound like a coin dropped on tile, and a new voicemail populated the list with a timestamp that sat 1 minute after a message in the family group chat, the blithe overlap tightening my jaw. I pressed play and listened to a laugh I knew so well I could have mapped its shape on a waveform, followed by a casual managerial voice, light with strategy and unburdened by conscience. Just call her Aunty, keeps her out. If language erase me, maybe audio can restore me. I renamed the file Anti-Protocol to MP3 because that's exactly how they use me, like a procedure. I began with the smallest controllable thing, the cursor blinking in a folder I titled with the date, and the same quiet stubbornness I used to keep at 3 a.m. when a fever would not listen to reason, and the child's hand would find my finger and squeeze until my bones remembered who I am, and I built a system around that squeeze, a lab more than a living room, a grid of file names that started with the year and marched forward with precision so tight it felt like prayer. And while the apartment picked up the metallic echo of rain ticking the railing, I fed the software the story they had tried to tell without me, ripping audio from voicemail, exporting chat logs into text, and scraping the timestamps until they aligned with the calendar blocks of school pickups and doctor visits and the smudged snapshots that still smelled like cake and chlorine and sleeplessness. The first pass was the sort of tedious that sometimes saves your life, a long plain line of speech to text riddled with errors where my name became money and the word guardian turned into garden. So I played each clip against the draft and marked corrections with a patience I didn't know I had, looping a sentence again and again until the vowels revealed themselves, and then I slid everything into a spreadsheet with columns that asked the kinds of questions humans avoid, because software doesn't care about feelings when it is counting. Date, time, participants, purpose, and a long field for notable phrases, the ones that lodged under my ribs like burrs. She'll calm down. We'll keep the papers simple. Judge won't dig. And next to each I recorded where I was, what I was doing, whether my name had been read correctly by anyone in the room, and whether I had kissed a warm forehead before stepping out into the part of the story that bills by the hour. Patterns arrived with the blunt honesty of fluorescent light, because when you chart clerical mistakes across a page, they stop looking like accidents and start resembling an itinerary. And every miskey, every missing email, every portal switch leaned in the same direction, a slope so consistent I could have skated it, and the column where my relation should have been a declaration read like a weather map of downgrades recorded in perfect weather. I stopped letting my breath stutter and polished my glasses with the edge of an old cotton shirt, a borrowed ritual that made me think of the judge's careful square of cloth, and the way he lifted the frames from his face as if clarity were a craft. And in that private imitation I found a steadiness I did not need permission to keep, because I was not preparing for a family chat now. I was preparing for a room where microphones amplify courage and also every tremor. Midway through that night, a new email slid into focus from the school registrar, a short professional note informed by policies they could recite in their sleep, confirming that my portal access had been removed at the request of the person listed as primary, and the date of the change matched the evening of a family meeting that had unfolded without me under the warm light of a dining room that used to feel like sanctuary, where dessert plates clattered and decisions were plated as consensus, and I felt the belittled version of myself rise to apologize for making this into a problem at the school. Then I anchored that impulse to the spreadsheet and the line item where this change would live, because the American genius for turning labels into gatekeeping only works if you accept that labels are the same as truth, and I had already decided that I would not. I took the audio apart with the same care you take when you lift a sleeping child from a car seat and don't want to wake them, easing out the filler words until the spine of each conversation shone, and I marked the moment where laughter covered strategy, the way a certain chuckle would arrive right before a suggestion was made to route a form through a friend. And I watched as my evening texts about pickups and snacks and school library books moved in parallel, with a chorus of assurances that I would calm down, as though insisting on my name were a storm, not a fact. And the ache for belonging that had once kept me quiet showed me its other face, the one that asks how much of yourself you are willing to subtract to be easy to love. And I answered in the only language that couldn't be patronized: evidence. In the morning, after the child slid into wakefulness and reached for me with that same unteachable certainty, I made eggs that stayed soft at the center and tucked a note into a lunchbox that just said, "See you," which is what I mean when I say home. And at the door, I kissed a forehead and watched the elevator doors reflect a blur of us before they met. And in that mirrored pause, I saw the woman I used to be, the one who wanted to be smaller for peace, and the woman I had to be now, who keeps her own record even when it feels like treason to memory. And I understood that fierce love is not volume, but clarity. I returned to the table and organized the binder the way a stage manager sets the show. The adoption papers tabbed in a sequence that made sense to my breath, the letter in a transparent sleeve that would not glare under the courtroom lights, the registrar's email printed in 12 point so the dates would not squint, and the audio index nested at the front like a program. Ms. Rivera entered my story with all the drama of a hole punch, a dry voice on the courthouse phone system returning my message with a careful economy that told me she had worked long enough to know the difference between help and interference. And she did not advise, but she did articulate, naming categories of documents and the routes by which originals travel and the places where a reasonable person might look for the thing everyone says is missing. And her phrasing left a breadcrumb trail without leaving a fingerprint. And I wrote every noun exactly as she said it, because I have learned that inside systems nouns matter more than adjectives, and that the person who brings the right nouns to a clerk window walks out with more than the person who brings a story. By late afternoon, I had layered the transcripts against the forms until intent stopped pretending to be error, the conversations about keeping things simple, aligning with the dates on which my access narrowed, and the gatekeeping words, temporary caregiver, reappeared as if conjured by wish rather than entered by someone with a login. And when I stepped back from the table, the map of my life brought me the kind of breath hold I had felt in court when the judge said my name aloud. A pause that is not fear, but calibration. The mouth of a river collecting itself before the sea. And in that hold, I let the first tears slide, not because I was undone, but because the story, when seen plainly, affirmed me with the precision of a well-read record. When I returned to the software, the waveform sat like a topographic map of a place I thought I knew, and as the blue mountains rose and fell, I scrolled to the section marked by 3 separate dates in my spreadsheet, the place where the language turned from care to choreography, and I pressed play and heard the cadence of the people I had fed and forgiven and deferred to, the bright little tactics tucked inside jokes about letting me rest, and then the pattern broke open with a laugh I could place in the dark, a familiar sound of bending the air into strategy, a voice I trusted orchestrating the label that had made me small, the peak sharply etched as if even the audio could see what it had caught. If there are originals, I must see them. Ms. Rivera slid a sticky note toward me. If an original existed, where would it be? The records office did not promise answers so much as procedures, a long counter nicked by years of elbows, sign-in logs with a ballpoint chained to a plastic flower, and the polite metronome of printers that never seemed hurried even when the hallway outside throbbed with crises. I wrote my name in the ledger with the same deliberation I used in court when the clerk read it into the microphone, feeling that small internal lift that comes when a room acknowledges you as a noun rather than a suggestion. And I passed the request slip under the glass to a woman whose expression had the neutral patience of someone who has seen entire lives reduced to reference numbers and still believes in the dignity of the index. Behind her, rolling shelves clicked and sighed. To my right, a scanner chimed as though pleased by its own accuracy. Above us, the fluorescent lights leaned hard on the afternoon. Ms. Rivera materialized with the soundless confidence of a person who understands that favor and fairness are not synonyms, and she did not ask me questions she could not record. but she placed a sticky note between us with 5 plain words that turned on a hinge in my chest because it was both riddle and instruction, a way of saying that originals have roots and routes have footprints, and if I wanted to be seen, I had to walk the path that ink would take. I asked for the case number, the subcategory, the date of intake, and the range of storage, and she answered in nouns, each so modest and precise that I felt the ache for belonging give way to a steadier kind of love, the fierce version that reads office maps like treasure and understands that a mother's job sometimes includes learning the architecture of other people's buildings. The procedural breadcrumb appeared in the second stack she pulled, a reference code that matched my docket and a notation that suggested a transfer to offsite, followed by a tidy stamp that should have been reassuring and was instead the color of a bruise. Misplaced. The word sat there with the nonchalance of a coffee ring, an accident that had learned to speak in past tense, and I pressed my fingertips to the counter to keep from reaching for the file through the glass, as if wanting hard enough could melt plastic. Ms. Rivera's eyes did not flicker towards sympathy, which I respected. She simply tapped the code once, a gentle percussion, and I wrote it in my notebook with the same caution I use when I write medication dosages, because this too required precision and would be measured later by someone with glasses and a strict sense of sequence. When I texted the update to the family chat, Daniel claimed momentum within 60 seconds, a volunteer with a cape, sewn from to-do lists, promising to pop by and clear it up. And before I could type the word no, he added a flourish about knowing the senior clerk and how these things are best handled quietly, which is a word that often means without you. By evening, he reported back that everything was taken care of, a phrase as empty as an unchecked box, offering no receipt, no chain of custody note, no scanned acknowledgement, only the smooth sheen of assurance. And while part of me longed to exhale into the softness of being handled, the judge's glasses flashed in my memory, the careful cloth buffing a lens until it admitted what it had missed, and I realized that peace without proof is a truce that ends the moment you need medicine or school access or the truth read aloud. That night, while the apartment dimmed to a single lamp and the dishwasher made the kind of steady sound that reassures a tired heart, I opened a different envelope, not official but sacred, a letter from the aunt who had made room for me before anyone else knew there would be a child to hold. Her penmanship had the firmness of women who keep lists on refrigerator doors and also know where the passports are, and in 2 unornamented paragraphs, she wrote of a temporary arrangement intended to bridge chaos toward clarity, an understanding that would be revisited and formalized once the dust settled, and there in the gentle weight of her trust I saw how far the word temporary had traveled, reinterpreted by convenience until it stood doorway wide between me and the life I had already built. I copied the dates into my log, slid the letter into a sleeve so the paper would not tiredly fold under the courtroom lights, and pressed my thumb to the ink as if touch could guarantee its future. Clarity matters because doors in America are named, and the difference between legal parent and caregiver is not semantic. It is the difference between being waved through and being asked to step aside, between seeing lab results as they populate and receiving a summary once decisions have been made, between signing a school plan and being looped in after the meeting, and the only way to keep those doors honest is to insist that names match function and paper match life. The more I studied the routes my documents had taken, the more I saw that the belittling had been laundered through procedure, and while a younger version of me might have found comfort in the affection that wrapped those choices, the woman who kissed a forehead that morning and felt a child's hand squeeze a goodbye knew better than to trade authority for approval. Pressure has a sound, a faint burr at the edges of sentences, and I heard it in the court's new notice requesting originals, a formal ask that recognized the possibility of tampering without accusing anyone yet. And I heard it in the family chat where emojis were replaced by paragraphs of affection and assurances that we're all on the same side. And I felt it in my own chest, a pressure that did not want to be a scream, that wanted instead to be an index. So I began to document the absences as carefully as the contents. Who claimed to carry which envelope? Who signed for what? When a form left a desk and who had keycard access to the room where it should have waited. I built a chain of custody tables so clean it looked fictional, which is what truth sometimes resembles when you set it beside habit. And as I typed the last line, I thought briefly of how my name had sounded in the judge's mouth, and the unexpected tears that had warmed my face like proof that relief is not surrender. It is a sign that your spine and your breath have agreed on a plan. The following afternoon, a clerk at a different window mentioned cameras in the corridor with the same offhand practicality people use when they ask if you want your receipt, and though she hadn't meant anything by it, the word settled inside my ribs with a precision that felt like a key sliding into a lock. So I filed the request and waited in the brittle patience of public buildings, the hum of the HVAC nudging at my focus while my hands lay flat on my folder and did not shake. When the footage arrived, the grain looked like snow trying to make sense of itself, a corridor drawn in grayscale where people became silhouettes and intentions traveled in posture, and I scrubbed through the time-stamped night when my file supposedly learned how to vanish, the screen bathing my face in a cold light that smelled like printer toner and resolve. At 11:41 p.m., a figure entered the frame, shoulders pitched forward in the easy urgency of someone confident about the door they are opening, and the jacket was not a generic shape, but a familiar one, the same quilted chevron I had hung by my own door after holidays, the same collar I had straightened before photographs, the same stitched emblem that made jokes about loyalty. The figure paused at the records room, glanced down the hall, and disappeared through a portal that should have required purpose to cross, and when they re-emerged, the posture was lighter, the emptiness in their hands too neat to be innocent, and I did not realize my breath had risen to my throat until the screen reflected the small tremor in my jaw. Corridor CCTV shows a familiar jacket near the records room on the night the file went missing. I paused the frame and named the jacket. Frame by frame, the jacket lifts a manila file. Pause. Daniel. The law likes corridors because they are honest about direction, and the public records hallway where I made my request was a narrow truth with scuffed baseboards and a camera bubble fixed like a patient eye in the ceiling tile. The form I filled out lived on a carbon copy that smelled faintly of solvent, and I stapled it to my incident report with a care that felt devotional, listing the date window the clerk had given me, the hour the ledger showed a retrieval, and the names of the staff on duty, so that no one could pretend the footage I was asking for was a fishing expedition, rather than the last net you cast after months of being told the fish had jumped themselves onto someone else's plate. When the USB with the corridor video was finally handed across the glass, plain, labeled with a black marker, so ordinary it bordered on insulting, I signed the chain of custody line with the same deliberate pen pressure I had practiced under my own lamp, and I watched the counterwoman log the exact minute because I needed my life to match the way the system keeps time. The footage itself had the grain of a snowstorm remembering how to fall, a gray drift across which bodies moved like dark smudges with intentions pinned to their shoulders, and I scrubbed the cursor slowly until the timestamp matched the ledger, then let the frames advance with the relentlessness of an escalator as the familiar chevron quilt of Daniel's jacket entered from the left, his head bent in an angle I knew from childhood photographs, where he leaned into our mother's stories, just enough to look attentive while his hand reached for the bowl. He carried no bag, which meant his pockets mattered, and he moved with the particular ease of a man who has already rehearsed his alibi, pausing only to glance down the hall the way you check a stovetop you've already turned off, then disappearing through the records room door with the brisk, credentialed flick that doors understand as permission. He re-emerged 3 minutes later, and the absence in his hands made more noise than a crash would have. There is a physics to theft that registers in posture, and the jacket lifted slightly as he tucked a rectangle under its fall, then smoothed the front once and left frame. And though the camera could not give me detail, the motion was enough to make my throat push against my breath. I paused the frame, my finger anchored on the trackpad, and pulled up the text he had sent that hour to the family chat, the one that breezed, "Out of town tonight but can try the court tomorrow." And I set it beside the digital clock boxed in the corner of the footage, both times insisting on their own reality until triangulation did what it always does in rooms where story and proof go to war. I messaged Emily with the politest version of the truth, because politeness is a useful tool even when it has failed you as a philosophy, and she called immediately with the voice that had soothed me a dozen times into patience, urging me not to make this bigger than it is, reminding me of the way institutions harden when they are embarrassed, and promising that Daniel had only been checking, a word as elastic as the family rules that had stretched until my name fell through. While she talked about optics and timing and the American tendency to punish messengers, my bank app pinged with a withdrawal that had never concerned me before because it was small, but that now sat on My screen with the neat alignment of a story finding its spine. Cash coming out 2 hours before the footage. The exact amount a notary charges for a walk-in stamp on a weekday evening. It should have been a dramatic reveal, but it arrived inside the ordinariness of a morning when I spread peanut butter across bread with the precision of a surgeon and slid carrot sticks into a small container that still smelled faintly of soap, adding a note with a heart I would deny under oath if anyone asked, because I needed something of mine to stand innocently in a day that was about to turn forensic. The school portal refused my password with the kind of bland certainty that institutions use to refuse people, and the screen told me the email on file had been changed, then asked me to contact the administrator if I felt this was an error, and I felt the old ache rise for a split second. Belittled, apologetic, tempted to accept Aunty, if it meant the door would open, before the memory of the judge's glasses, lifted and wiped until they cooperated, steadied me into the fierce love that does not bargain. At the dining table, I assembled exhibits the way you would lay out instruments before a delicate operation, because I wanted the hearing to move like muscle memory in the judge's hands. A vertical timeline chart with a highlighted stripe running through the critical week, a clean audio index with time codes next to phrases like, "She'll calm down," and "We'll keep the papers simple." A letter excerpt in a sleeve that wouldn't glare under courtroom fluorescence. The registrar's email printed large enough that dates and user IDs could be seen at a glance. And finally, the CCTV stills printed as a sequence. The jacket's arc narrated without words. I practiced the order the way a pianist practices scales, knowing the law respects a story that respects sequence. And when I paused for water, I let my eyes close long enough to see my name on the mic, hear it read without shrinkage, feel the breath hold in the room resolve into something that might be called relief. The court date came faster than holidays do, and the notice sat in my inbox like a small lit square of inevitability, the kind that makes people call at midnight to suggest family resolutions and no need to drag this out. And I let those calls roll into voicemail while I packed my bag, placed the USB in a rigid case, and laid the binder atop a sweater that smelled faintly of laundry soap and the child's shampoo, a domestic trace inside an adversarial errand. In the elevator the next morning, a small hand slid into mine with that same unteachable certainty, a squeeze that traveled up into my chest with the authority of a signature, and I bent to kiss a forehead that was finally cool, whispering a promise I planned to keep in writing and on the record, because this was not a quarrel anymore. This was a petition for the truth to acknowledge the work that had already been done in the quiet. We were 5 days from the hearing when the anonymous email arrived, an unremarkable subject line that would have hid in the flood if not for the one sentence waiting inside. No greeting, no punctuation except the period that landed like a gavel. Check the last page of your adoption file. It isn't yours. I read it twice and then a third time, my skin prickling in that old animal way that knows a new predator by the sound of leaves, and all at once the jacket, the cash, the corridor, the portal, the midnight calls organize themselves into a single hinge the case would swing on. Check the last page of your adoption file. It isn't yours. The last page is where signatures live and lie. I know the way my hand curls on a Y. This Y was straight, practiced, masculine. I spread the pages across the dining table the way you lay out instruments before a delicate operation, the familiar rustle of laser paper mixing with the domestic hush of a dishwasher finishing its last rinse. On the left, I placed a half-dozen documents I had signed over the past year: school permission slip, insurance form, pediatric consent, a rent addendum, each one carrying the loop I learned at 12 when my teacher said, "Own the flourish if you're going to have one." On the right, I clipped the final page of the adoption file under a lamp and angled the light until the ink stopped throwing glare. Side by side, my name should have felt like a chorus. Instead, it sounded like a rehearsal by someone who only knew the melody. There is a rhythm that belongs to a signature, not mystical but mechanical, the way muscle remembers distance. My downstrokes usually shade darker than my lifts because I write like I walk, sure on the weight, light on the turn. And there in the file the pressure reversed, the line too even, as if the pen had been worn not to betray fatigue. The spacing told on itself as well. My letters tend to drift apart after the second syllable when I'm hurrying to pick up a phone or pull a pan off heat. But this hand stayed disciplined all the way through, patient in a way mine isn't at 10 p.m., when forms meet bedtime. Most damning was the why. Mine curls like a question mark only I can answer, a small private hook that has followed me from teenage notebooks to court pleadings. On the file, the why descended with rigid confidence, no curl, no ask, an ending drawn by someone who signs for a living. I breathed slow, polishing my glasses with the hem of an old cotton shirt, the way the judge had polished his with that square of cloth, and when I set them back on my face, the difference sharpened further, the way magnification settles debate by refusing drama. I tried to give myself every doubt, even whispered the kind of excuses clerks love, different pen, bad angle, a rush at the copier. But the lines would not align with plausible error. I felt a flush rise in my cheeks that wasn't shame. It was the intimate shock of realizing someone had practiced me in ink, sounding out my name in strokes until they believed they could pass, borrowing the choreography of my hand to tell a story that walked me out of my own life. I opened the notary ledger next, the one I had requested after a clerk's offhand comment turned into a breadcrumb. The entry for that date confirmed ID verified, the tidy imprimatur that usually settles questions. But beneath it, the ID number stuttered into a sequence that wasn't mine, 2 digits inverted and one that belonged to nobody in my wallet. I traced the sequence with my finger, then checked the stamp time against the birthday video again, and there it was, frosting on cheeks at 6:17 p.m., a chorus stumbling over the second line of the song, and a ledger insisting I was in front of an official at 6:19 with a card I do not own. The ledger didn't convict anyone by itself, but it put a blister on the timeline that could not be smoothed with clerical. For viewers who live where process is king, I'll say the quiet part plain. Forgery is a conclusion the court reaches, not a word you toss into a microphone because you're angry. There is a spectrum between honest mistake and criminal intent, clerical substitution, negligent misfiling, unauthorized completion, and the law won't let you skip steps just because your heart knows. What the law will accept is pattern plus provenance, consistent tells across documents, anomalies in logs, and the unmistakable gravity of motive. I took photographs that framed the margins, captured pen pressure with raking light, and labeled every image with time, device, and angle. Then I stacked them in a binder where the story spoke in nouns: signature, ledger, index, stamp, ID. I called Ms. Rivera and left only the facts that could live on a voicemail. She returned my call with the same careful cadence as always, and in that neutral tone that passes for mercy in government buildings, she outlined the path that a reasonable person could follow: a motion to inspect originals under supervision, a request for the chain of custody log from intake to storage, and, if the court approved, comparison under a document camera where even a shy line cannot pretend. She did not say sorry. She did not say fight. She named the doors. I wrote down every door. By midnight, Daniel pivoted. The texts that used to arrive as favors came dressed as a peace offering. He proposed a family sit-down before the hearing, a resolution that would keep embarrassment out of the courthouse and protect the child from drama. He suggested I withdraw the motion to inspect and let him present a united front on our behalf, because judges, he claimed, appreciate families that solve their own mess quietly. He added 2 sentences about stress and sleep and how I deserved rest, and it took me a full minute to realize he was still playing the same song. Aunty will calm down, just in a lower key. I put the phone face down, and for the first time in months did not feel tempted by the chair he was pulling out for me. Morning arrived with soft footsteps and a small weight climbing into my lap, a hand finding mine, squeezing once with that unteachable certainty children possess. I kissed a warm forehead that no longer burned, and felt the ache for belonging dissolve into something truer, a breath hold that wasn't fear this time, but readiness, the body's way of saying name yourself before anyone else does. When the phone rang, I watched it as if it were a stage, half expecting another family volley. Instead, a new voice introduced itself with courtroom silk and seminar politeness. Let's keep this civil. Labels can be cultural. Civility isn't clarity. Labels are cultural, he said. Contracts are clarity, I answered. He introduced himself with the kind of practiced warmth that sells luxury sedans and settlement agreements, a voice tuned for conference rooms and holiday disputes, soft enough to pass for kindness if you wanted to be lulled, precise enough to pass for authority if you wanted to be led. I let him speak first, because people reveal their hand when they think they are setting the table, and he laid out a pitch so polished it squeaked. Keep Aunty on the documents, formalize it even, and in practice, he insisted, nothing would change. The school would still call me. The pediatric office would still let me sign. The family would still respect my role. This is about avoiding friction, he said, about honoring culture while streamlining the file. He asked me to imagine the relief, the peace, the optics of a family that solves its own problems without dragging a judge into intimate terrain. I asked him a question that sounded simple enough to be harmless. If nothing will change in practice, why not put my legal name on every record and called at our culture, one where the person who wakes for the fevers also signs for the medicine? The pause that followed tightened like thread pulled through cloth. He tried again, slower, as if I were missing his nuance. The word auntie was respectful, he said. It protected sensibilities, mirrors, reputations. It soothed elders. It traveled well across potlucks and prayer circles and end-of-year programs. Couldn't I accept a formal version of the nickname, the way cities accept honorary streets that don't redirect traffic? I told him traffic matters, and so do ambulances, and the routes that save lives are not honorary. When I repeated my counter, write my legal name into every field, and we can discuss any cultural footnote he likes, he reached for the kind of justification that works when people are more tired than alert. He said the court file already contained a sealed page that accommodates my role and should satisfy any judge willing to read between the lines. I didn't breathe for a beat, because sealed was not a word he should have known, and accommodates was not a word that belonged near motherhood. I asked how he knew about a sealed page. He pivoted to tone, that graceful dodge where the content goes missing while the performance gets critiqued. Let's keep this civil, he said, choosing the voice you use with a neighbor who overprunes hedges. Emotion clouds process. We're offering you respect. Respect without accountability is choreography. I opened my laptop and clicked the record option, announced the recording as the law requires, and kept the conversation under a lamp where euphemism can't pretend to be daylight. He did not resist. He just got prettier with his vocabulary. Colloquially known as Aunty, he intoned, auditioning the phrase for a future paragraph, and I wrote it down the way you write down a chemical formula you plan to neutralize. I asked whether the phrase would appear in medical consents, court orders, school plans. He said it would appear where appropriate. I said the appropriate place for nicknames is cake frosting, not the line where rights live. The ache for belonging nudged me once, that old soft animal asking if peace tasted better than proof, and then a clearer animal spoke, the fierce one that knows the difference between quiet and erasure. I told him I would not accept back-channel deals. I would not withdraw the motion to inspect originals. I would not be soothed into a paperwork arrangement that left me polite and powerless. We'll see you in court, I said, and he replied with the professional sigh of a man who has marked women like me in pencil. She is determined she will tire. He recommended we de-escalate the narrative. I told him narratives escalate themselves when facts are outnumbered. When we hung up, I transcribed. I pulled the lines that mattered and slotted them into my phrase bank for the hearing. Colloquially known as Aunty. Nothing will change in practice. Sealed page. Read between the lines. I typed them in a sober font that makes even nonsense behave, then set them beside the adoption pages and the notary ledger with the wrong ID number, and the CCTV still where Daniel's jacket learned how to lift a file without showing a hand. On the dining table, I built a geography of my case. Timeline chart on the left, audio index at top right, letter from my aunt in a sleeve that wouldn't glare, school registrar email with its timestamp boxed in yellow, and at the center the USB labeled anti-protocol, the plastic catching afternoon light like a small, quiet blade. My witness list grew a spine, the pediatric receptionist who could speak to the renewal she read on her screen, the registrar who processed the portal change, a neighbor who had chatted with me at the birthday party during the exact minute the ledger claimed I stood before a notary downtown. Ms. Rivera would not testify. She is the door, not the foot that steps through. But her nouns had given me the route to ask a judge for a supervised inspection without looking like a person who confuses conspiracy with care. I tabbed the binder until it looked like a city of colored rooftops and practiced unzipping the evidence pouch without fumbling. because in a courtroom, competence is a language nearly as persuasive as grief. Night didn't ask permission before arriving, but it came kindly, with a sleeping child breathing slow in the next room, and a note from school that smelled like pencil shavings and soap. And I let myself think briefly of the judge's glasses lifted and wiped, of my name read correctly into a microphone, of the breath hold that turns into relief, the kind that wobbles your knees and leaves you laughing even as you cry. I was still at the table at 1:13 a.m., labeling screenshots, when my phone pulsed with an email from Emily. Subject line tidy, body shorter than habit, an attachment glinting at the bottom as if daring me to click. Updated guardianship.tdf. I was never consulted. Files have fingerprints if you know where to look. The PDF's creation time was 5 minutes after a missed call from Daniel. I opened the attachment the way you lift a lid when you already smelled a burn, bracing for smoke while the night leaned against the windows and the apartment clock started counting in legal minutes instead of human ones. The file name announced itself with a tidy confidence, Updated Guardianship PDF, and for a moment I watched the cursor blink like a pulse, as if the machine itself were reminding me to breathe. When the document finally unrolled across the screen, it looked respectable in the way danger often does. Serif headings, numbered clauses, careful margins, a tone so civil it wanted to be mistaken for mercy. I did what people who can't afford to be tricked do. I went straight to forensics, properties first. The dialog box opened into biography, created at 1:18 a.m., 5 minutes after the missed call that had thudded across my lock screen. Modified at 1:23 a.m., application set to a common editor, author field populated with an email alias I recognized from Daniel's project proposals, the one he uses when he wants to sound official and untraceable at the same time. Revision history next. 2 saves within the span of a single song, a third at 1:27, with only the footer changed. Embedded fonts told their own small truth. One house font I use, one I do not. Proof that the file had borrowed style from my earlier drafts, while introducing a stranger's hand into the body. That's the thing about PDFs. They come dressed as final, but they keep souvenirs of their making. The update performed its downgrade with the politeness of a maitre d' escorting you to a worse table. My designation slid from mother cha, guardian, to relative caregiver, an administrative shove disguised as a clarification, with a parenthetical that made my throat go cold. Colloquially known as Aunty. There it was, the nickname stitched into law, a smile weaponized into clause, and I could see exactly how this would read to a person skimming between hearings. Gentle, cultural, convenient. My eyes found a sentence at the bottom of page 2 that set my teeth on edge, almost familiar but just off. In daily practice, the child finds comfort with the relative caregiver who has historically ensured continuity of care. I had written a version of that line months ago in a memo to the school, except in mine the noun was mother, and continuity meant I signed the forms. Here the sentence had been lifted, rinsed, and turned toward me like a mirror that shortens your height. I phoned Ms. Rivera and left only the nouns that belong on voicemail. Timestamp, author field, creation time. A question about whether the court accepts emailed updates to pending files. She called back before morning, her voice running on that dry kindness bureaucracy's perfect. No, she said. The court does not treat emailed PDFs as amendments to filed documents. Originals move by rule, not hope. If someone wished to alter standing, there were motions for that, and hearings, and service, and signatures that could survive light. I could hear the hum of the building behind her, printers waking like old dogs, and I imagined the judge's glasses catching the first fluorescent shimmer of the day, a ritual of sight waiting for the case that demanded it. I sat down to draft a notice of potential fraud, and the language steadied me the way a handrail steadies a staircase. I attached exhibits labeled with a precision that felt like a spine. Exhibit A, the properties pane with creation and author. Exhibit B, the relative caregiver clause annotated in the margin where the copy-paste cadence diverged from my draft. Exhibit C, the email's timestamp against my carrier log showing Daniel's missed call. Exhibit D, the earlier school memo I'd written, so a clerk could see the sentence in its original skin. I printed each to PDF because even files need their own paper trail, then slid hard copies into sleeves that would not glare. It should have been purely procedural, But in the moment between saves, I felt what every woman feels when someone rewrites her life without asking. The hot horror of being narrated by a voice that has never stayed up with your child through a fever. The insult of being translated into a supporting role in a story you carried to term. My hand shook and then did not. I stood and walked to the bedroom where a small shape slept, with their mouth slightly open, the breath rising in that even rhythm that trained mine to slow on nights I was sure I would snap. I touched a warm forehead, not to check for heat this time, but to remind myself what clarity is for, and then I went back to the table and finished the notice. Who benefits? It's a plain question that courts respect. If I am not legally mother, guardianship decisions consolidate under people who love control. Reputations remain unsmudged by the paper truth that doesn't fit the holiday card. Financial levers stay where they have always been, in the pocket that has never known a midnight copay or an unpaid day off after a clinic visit. The motive column on my spreadsheet filled itself in access, optics, hierarchy. I imagined the attorney's voice on the stand, saying, colloquially known as Aunty, as if it were a lullaby and not a lock. At 2:06 a.m., as if the night had been listening, a text slid across my screen, no contact photo, a number with 3 sevens in a row as neat as a dare. The message wore the same polished threat families have used since language learned to behave. If you take this to court, we'll tell the truth about your past. I read it once, then again, feeling the instinct to hide puncture and then drain away, replaced by the steadier heat that has been building since the judge read my name into a microphone, and the room held its breath because finally someone did. I set the phone down on the binder and listened to the apartment's quiet. I will tell it first. I have a past, loss, and debt, but none of it changes the night a feverish child clung to me and said, Mama. I decided to tell it myself because silence makes room for invention, and I have already seen what happens when other people narrate me. So I opened a fresh document while the apartment held that late-hour stillness that makes honesty sound louder, and I wrote a confession in the only format I trust, concise, specific, accountable, naming the years I wish I had budgeted better and the months I borrowed against hope, the relationship I stayed in too long because leaving felt like detonating a life, the job I took for the insurance even though the work left a film on my soul, and the stack of parking tickets that became a small storm when I was driving from clinic to school to pharmacy and back again. Then I wrote the day I learned the difference between shame that keeps you quiet and responsibility that makes you act, which is the day I started a binder that now sits on my table like a spine. I knew my audience as surely as I know the turns of my own street, because Americans forgive the imperfect when they see the art clearly. So I built the timeline like a bridge, not to excuse but to demonstrate motion, and I calibrated the tone away from spin and toward the kind of authenticity that shows rather than swears, because a growth arc is not a slogan. It is the slow replacement of panic with plan, and the plan here is simple. Names match labor, paper matches life, rights follow care. I wrote about the morning I met the judge's gaze and watched him lift his glasses with that patient ritual of people who understand that clarity is maintained, and I wrote about the sensation of hearing my name read into a microphone with the steadiness of an oath, and how that moment did more than dignify me. It called me into a larger honesty, the kind that refuses to keep secrets, so that threats have nothing to hold. Then I drew the legal line that matters, because moral imperfection does not dissolve legal standing when caregiving history is visible and verifiable, and I explained how the law separates character from capacity, how signatures trump adjectives and timestamps don't blush, and how the most revealing question in a courtroom is not who is perfect, but who did the work, who woke in the dark, who signed the forms, who stood at the window with a cold washcloth counting breaths until the fever turned, and I placed my answers beside exhibits because opinion is combustible while paper tends to burn slower, and when smoke clears, the ink remains. I took out the letter from my late aunt and read it again, because grief can be a compass when memory threatens to wander, and her handwriting steadied me with its grocery list certainty, declaring that the arrangement was temporary only while we moved from storm to shore, and confirming the intent that once the dust settled, I would become the legal parent, not as a favor but as fulfillment, and I slid that letter into a sleeve that would not glare, then highlighted the dates that align with pediatric logs and school attendance records, and I felt the ache for belonging rise and then soften, because belonging, when it is real, comes with paperwork that can be held up to the light without breaking. Emily's messages scrolled through my phone like a glossy brochure for a house with structural problems, all curb appeal and no foundation, and I saw her PR playbook for what it was: the art of brand management over truth, the way polite euphemisms get sanded into documents until a person like me becomes a mascot for family unity, the kind who is thanked in speeches and erased in minutes, and I wrote 2 sentences I plan to read aloud if asked. I'm not an optic, I'm a parent, and we do not solve reputational discomfort by relocating my name to the margins, because you cannot build safety for a child on a ledger that treats the primary caregiver as a courtesy. Reframing is power when done in daylight, so I wrote the line I want the clerk to hear clearly in the transcript, that my name is not negotiable and neither is the child's safety, and that every time Aunty appears where mother belongs, a door closes that should remain open, and a nurse reads a screen that will not let her tell me what I need to know fast enough to help, and I let the fierce love that has been my metronome rise until the paragraphs found their pulse. Then I returned to the binder with a steadiness that felt like breath hold before a dive, checking the tabs one more time, tightening the elastic loops on the USB case, and pressing the adoption pages into order so the final page, the one I now know to be a performance, sits where the light will catch its pretense. I printed the letter and circled the sentences that matter with a pen that will show up under the document camera, then aligned those lines with school pickups and clinic visits, penciling cross-references in the margins the way a stage manager marks cues. And as I worked, I heard the echo of the courtroom in my head. The small hush before testimony, the dry click of the microphone waking, the faint squeak of leather as chairs adjust, and I remembered the child's hand squeezing mine outside the elevator on the day this began. The unteachable certainty in that pressure, and I pressed a kiss into a cool forehead before tucking a note into a backpack that simply said, "See you," which is my promise and my plan. When the email from Ms. Rivera arrived, it landed with the authority of a gavel without the theater, a sentence with no adjectives and all consequence. Judge requested all originals tomorrow. Bring your USB. And for a heartbeat I felt the tears of relief that arrive when an institution finally asks for what you have been assembling in the quiet, followed immediately by the protective joy that sharpens my focus rather than melting it. Because tomorrow is not performance. Tomorrow is paper meeting voice and names meeting labor, and my life answering to itself in a room designed for answers. The room where paper meets voice is waiting. Every time the clerk said my legal name into the microphone, the room shifted toward me. The courtroom had the same institutional hum as before, but the rhythm was different now, as if the vents and fluorescents had agreed to keep time with the binder beneath my hands. My exhibits were stacked in the order Ms. Rivera's nouns had taught me to respect. Timeline first, then CCTV stills, then the letter in its no-glare sleeve, then the audio. I registered the bench, the flags, the seal, the polished rail, and then let those details fall away until only procedure remained. When the clerk read my name into the record, clean and steady, a subtle pivot happened in the room. Counsel shifted in their chairs, the gallery's whisper thinned, and my spine answered with that breath, hold I now recognized, not fear this time, but alignment. Opposing counsel started with culture, smooth as ever. He said the word like upholstery, something meant to soften hard benches and harsher truths. He spoke of honorifics and respect, of multi-generational households and the gentle ways families name their own roles. The judge listened without impatience, but he did not write down adjectives. He wrote down outcomes. In what ways? He asked. Did the label affect access, authority, or accountability? He adjusted his glasses with the cloth I'd come to trust as a metronome for clarity, and I felt relief braid into resolve. We were not here to admire euphemisms. We were here to measure what they did. I began with the timeline. The chart lay under the document camera like a runway, dates landing in sequence. The pediatric office denial aligned with the temporary caregiver renewal. The portal removal aligned with a family meeting. The corridor footage timestamp aligned with the text claiming someone was out of town. I used the fewest words possible, letting lines and boxes perform the labor of persuasion, and when I looked up, the judge was following with the same calm attention he had given the clerk's oath. He moved the lens once, precisely to bring a date into sharper relief. The cloth appeared, the glasses cleared. CCTV next. The stills marched in 4 panels: entrance, door, exit, departure. The jacket made its silent case. Opposing counsel tried to smudge with uncertainty, resolution, angle, plausibility, until the judge asked, "Is there an alternative explanation supported by documents?" Silence loosened at the family table. A foot tap, a cough, the paper rustle of people wishing to be anywhere else. I kept my eyes on the screen and my finger on the binder's spine. The letter from my aunt came third. I read the 2 sentences that mattered and stopped. The judge nodded at the dates, matched them to the timeline, and asked counsel if he disputed authenticity. He did not. Then, because the order had been promised, the audio. The file name appeared on the court monitor, Aunty protocol.mp3. I warned the room that the clip was brief. We played the 31 seconds we had queued, and the laugh I once could have found in the dark arrived on the speakers, followed by the sentence that had finally taught me what the nickname had been doing all along. "Just call her Aunty, keeps her out." The words landed with the dull force of a gavel that has learned restraint. The judge did not react theatrically. He simply made a notation, then adjusted his glasses again, the cloth moving in a small, practiced square that told me he was preparing to look closer, not move on. He asked for the adoption file's final page. Under the camera, ink became topography. I explained pen pressure and rhythm without pretending to be an expert, then placed genuine signatures beside the page in question. The difference didn't need adjectives. The Y that knows me from 12 years old curled on the left. The foreign Y stood on the right with its straight, confident tail. Counsel suggested angle, fatigue, pen type. The judge asked for the notary ledger, and we put it under glass. There it was. ID verified, the wrong number, the timestamp that collided with a chorus of off-key birthday voices. "Chain of custody?" the judge asked, and the clerk, who had never smiled at anyone in particular, offered the log. The gaps were paper, not rumor. Silence gathered new meanings at the family table. Heads tilted down. Notes were written that did not improve the view. A throat cleared in a register that betrayed more than it concealed. I kept my voice measured, first person anchored to exhibits, one hand steady on the binder to keep it from transmitting the fine tremor running through me. I answered only what was asked. Yes, I was listed as temporary caregiver on dates X and Y. Here are the renewals I did not authorize. Yes, portal access changed on this date. Here is the registrar's confirmation. Yes, I received an emailed update. Here are the properties showing author and time. I did not speculate. I did not sermonize. I let nouns do their work. The judge reached for the cloth again. He cleaned the lenses as the document camera idled on the 2 Ys, then replaced the glasses and looked at counsel, then at me, then at the file. "I'm not interested in what anyone calls anyone at dinner," he said, and the sentence entered the room like a door opening. "I am interested in who had authority and how that authority was used." Relief came sideways, a loosening at the base of my skull, a quiet in my shoulders, tears threatening but disciplined by the need to name the last exhibit correctly. I touched the USB case with one finger, a small reminder of all the nights I'd label files while listening to a child's breathing move from ragged to even, and I let that rhythm steady me through the final answers. The clerk said my name once more, clear and unshrunk, and I felt the protective joy that follows affirmation. Not triumph, not yet, but the feeling of a door that had been misnamed swinging on its true hinge. The judge asked quietly, "Who benefits, financially or otherwise, from Ms. Nitio not being named mother?" The answer is already in the record. When the judge finally took off his glasses, I felt seen for the first time all day. He set the frames on the bench blotter, as if removing a visor after a long field, looked down at the file that had tried to make me smaller, and spoke in the tempered cadence that turns oxygen into law. The court found that my legal standing as mother was established by conduct and corroborated by documents. The record would reflect my name, unabridged, across medical, educational, and custodial entries. Any agency or institution holding a contrary notation was ordered to correct it. The clerk repeated my name into the microphone. Precise, deliberate, final. and the room's center of gravity tilted toward me the way a compass needle finds north after trembling. It was not loud, it was accurate. Then came the paragraph that pulled the pin from the quiet weapon I had carried for years. In injunctive language that will live longer than anyone's manners, the judge barred the substitution of aunty for my legal relation in any official document or communication. The word could remain in private affection if freely chosen, he said, but it could not enter a form, a portal, a ledger, or a chart in place of the term that opened doors. He dictated the order with the patience of a craftsman, spelling out the fields most likely to be misused, naming school rosters and clinic screens, adoption records and consent forms, so no one could later pretend the rule was unclear. The pen in his hand did not shake. Mine did not either. Accountability did not arrive as vengeance. It arrived as process. The courtie referred the file for inquiry into document tampering and chain of custody breaches, directing the records office to produce logs that would show who touched what and when. The notary ledger would be examined under the same light that had revealed the wrong ID number to me at my dining table. The CCTV timestamps would be matched to key card swipes. If errors were innocent, the paper would exonerate. If not, the paper would name. I listened with my palms flat against the binder I built on nights when fear asked for a chair, and I gave it a job instead. And for the first time in months, my breath and my posture agreed. Outside, in the corridor where fluorescent bulbs flatten even celebration into a kind of winter, the clerk handed me a stamped copy while saying my name again, and tears found me in the simple way water does when you stop clenching. Down the hallway, a small body flew into my ribs with enough force to reorder my bones, arms tight around my neck, laughter ricocheting off cinder block. Someone, it doesn't matter who, called my name the way you call a person to come see the thing you knew you'd find all along, and hearing it ring unshrunk in that impersonal space turned the concrete into an aisle. The child's hand found mine and squeezed with that unteachable certainty, and I bent to press a kiss into a cool forehead, the oldest benediction I know. In the reflection of the elevator's steel, I saw a woman who had been belittled, then a woman who ached to belong, then the one who chose fierce love over choreography, and I watched her mouth form the word, "Mother, the way you taste the truth before you say it." Transformation, I learned, is not a firework. It is the quiet conviction that clarity is care. I am done apologizing for the size of my name. I am done treating boundaries as rudeness. When a receptionist asks relation, I will answer in nouns that open doors. When a form tries to minimize, I will write in the square that matches labor. When someone argues culture, I will remember that culture is home only when it does not erase the person who keeps the lights on. The judge left behind his folded lens cloth on the rail for a moment no one noticed, a small square of fabric the color of slate, and I lifted it with the reverence you reserve for tokens that are more idea than object. I tucked it into my pocket, not as a trophy but as a promise to keep things clear, to polish language the way he polished glass, until the view refuses to lie. For those who live where I live, in the overlap of love and systems, the takeaway is plain and portable. Keep a paper trail that can stand up without your voice. Learn the nouns that unlock counters. Escalate in writing before you're required to perform in rooms with microphones. Assume good faith until the logs say otherwise. When they don't, trust the logs. And when you are tempted to accept a nickname as policy because arguing feels un-American, remember that in this country doors and rights answer to the name that matches the work. We left the courthouse with our order, and the afternoon leaning bright against glass. At home, the backpack dunked onto the floor. The lunchbox came out with the smudge of a half-eaten apple, and we stood in the kitchen that had heard every argument and apology and lullaby, while the printer spat out copies for clinics and schools, and anyone who had ever hidden behind a drop-down menu. My name looked ordinary again on paper, which is the greatest honor a court can give a person, to make the extraordinary labor of proving yourself disappear into the convenience of a correct form. The next morning, the mail pushed through the slot with a heavy envelope addressed in the rectangular hand of institutions. The return address belonged to a different office than the ones I knew. Inside, a subpoena rested on cream stock, formal as a handshake at a funeral. The notary wants to talk. If a respectful nickname ever cost you access or authority, tell me where it happened and what you did. Drop one boundary you're putting in writing after this, so others can learn from it. Share this with someone fighting a quiet paperwork battle. Receipts change outcomes. Subscribe for part 2, The Notary Speaks, and turn on notifications so you don't miss it. Your story in the comments might be the evidence someone else needs tomorrow.